There's also some times when I just want to push a color into the bright or the dark portion of my picture. And in this case, I didn't necessarily like how the bright part of the picture is looking. I actually didn't want it to look so neutral there. I wanted it to look more like the lights in your house would look if you took a picture at night. You know how they'd all look warm? So what I'm going to do here is for highlights, I'm going to take the slider called hue and I'm going to move it over to, this is pointing at a yellowish orange. Now when I do that, the picture won't change at all, because what I'm doing is I'm choosing the color that I'm wanting to push into the bright part of the image, but the slider below that tells it how much, how strong should I push it in, and that slider's at 0 right now. Now if you want to see the color though, there's a trick. There's a hidden feature in here that lets you preview the color, and that is if you hold down the Option key and click, it will act as if the slider below is set to 100. Meaning, show me a lot of this color, and I can move it around then and say, well, what color would I want in there? Not greenish, not magenta, no more, oh, there we go. That's somewhere in there. That's the color. So holding down the Option key when you move the hue slider is going to preview the color as if you had the saturation slider maxed out to 100. That can be useful. Then we can dial in how much we want now with the saturation slider. We already saw what it would look like if we maxed it out. So I'm just going to bring this up while I look at the image and say how much of that color do I want to push in to the building. And oftentimes I just kind of move it back and forth so I remind myself of what it looked like without. And I say, oh, how much? And I try to push it until it's too much and then back off, because you never know if going further would improve the image unless you go too far. So I try to go too far and then back off. Below that, we have choices for shadows, and that's where I can force a color into the dark portion of the image. So in this case, the blue sky and the water would be the dark portion of the image, and I don't always push colors into both, but let's just do it, see if it would help. So first I'd hold down the Option key, Alt and Windows, and click on the hue slider and say, well, I don't want red in there because that doesn't look natural to me. This is pushing color into the dark part of the image. Ooh, there the blue sky looks somewhat interesting. And there the water and stuff is looking interesting. Remember, this is what it would look like if you did it with a slider at 100. We're not going to bring it up that high, so it's not going to be this much. So you don't have to go, ooh, I don't like it everywhere. Just look at the dark part of the picture. I'm not looking at the opera house right now. I'm looking at the sky and the water. Then below that, we have saturation, which is how strong do you want to push that color in there. And so we can come up here and say, well, how strong we want that. Could bring it up to there. Don't know that this image necessarily needs it. But the problem with doing this is if we push color into the bright part of our image and the dark part of the image, Photoshop is not always thinking about this the way I would like to when it comes to the image, because in this case we have a very specific object here that I'm thinking of as the bright parts, and that's the opera house and the reflection of it. And Photoshop is thinking generically about bright ranges. So there is a slider right here called Balance. And Balance determines where do the highlights stop and the shadows begin. When it's right in the middle, then it's right in the middle of that brightness range, where it's going to say, hey, this is where we're going to stop applying some color and start applying it to the shadows. So if I take this and slide it around, I'll slide it way to the left and then way to the right. I can control how far the color that's going into the highlights extends into the rest of the picture. And so I'm going to move that around and see if I can get the yellowish color to get into the opera house the most, and the bluish color to be limited to the water. So you need to move Balance around to just see at what point is it that we get a nice balance there. And once you have that, you might need to go and fine-tune your other sliders, because you might find you had way too much in the end, or not enough, because you were being concerned about the opera house when you're moving this, and now you got it where it's not affecting the opera house, so you are now capable of fine-tuning that. So I'll hit this little button in the lower right of my preview to show you what it looks like with default settings. This is with no split toning at all. And then I'll hit that button again, and this is what I just did to it. I'm trying to make it so it's subtle. It's not a massive change, but can you guys see it? And I like it more. I don't know if you do or not. Everybody has a different idea of what a picture should look like. But I like the Opera House better when it has the warm feeling to it. And my sky just has the tiniest bit of additional color in it. Make sense? Split toning. Split toning means shift the color of the bright portion of the image, the dark portion of the image, or both. And you don't always have to apply it to both. Now, if you combine that idea with the idea of converting to black and white, you can get more interesting looking black and whites. Because instead of just being a neutral black and white, where there's no hint of color whatsoever, we can put a hint of color in the highlights and a hint of color in the shadows that is different in both of those two areas. So this one has no color in it. Let's look at a few that do have color. Do you see the warmth in this image? That's because of split toning. If you convert the image to black and white first, with that one little checkbox that was under the tab called HSL, all the color goes away, and then right after that, go to the tab that's called split toning, and now you can say, let's put a hint of color back in, and we can tone that black and white. Here's a cool toned black and white, more of a green kind of tone. And this one has warm highlights, I think, like yellowish highlights and bluish shadows, if I remember right, or from what I'm perceiving here. And let's open each one of those and see what it would look like if we didn't use that toning. So I'll go here to split toning, and then I'll click on that little icon in the lower right of the preview to say what would it look like with all these zeroed out, and then I'll turn it back on. That little icon down here, just so you know, that guy, if you hover over it, it'll tell you. It's going to toggle between the current settings and the default settings. It says for the visible panel only. What that means is only turn off the settings for the tab I'm working on. Don't turn off the ones I did over in this tab, just this one. And so clicking that toggles between zeroing out the settings that are there and having what you had a moment ago. And so here's just a black and white, and there's a toned black and white. And you can see it looks like the color that was put in, there was kind of an orangish color in the highlights and a slightly more yellow color, but only a little bit more yellow in the shadows. And it's a little stronger in the highlights than it is in the shadows. So this is a very similar tone in the highlight and the shadow. The next one, if I turn that off, there's just the black and white. And there's the toned black and white. And if you look at the two colors that are being used, we have more of a yellowish in the highlights, because you can see where that thing is pointing to, and we have more of a cyanish in the shadows. And it has more color in the highlights than it does the shadows. Now I can fine tune it, of course, wherever I want. Just move these around, and I can get completely different looks in this image. It's sometimes useful, though, when you're moving them around to hold down the Option key so you can see it at full strength, so you really get a sense for what color am I pushing in there. And you might say, well, I want a bluish looking image, so I'm going to go for this. You let go, and then you're going to move saturation around to say how much blue looks right in this particular picture. Move it until it's too much, and then back off. Then I'll go up to the highlights and say, okay, hold on Option. What color? I'm trying to remember the blue I saw earlier. And I would think, what would go with that blue? I'm thinking somewhere in there. And then bring this up again to say, how strong should I get it? Somewhere in there. And then balance. How far should it extend into those other areas? And it takes some practice. If you're not used to doing this, what I'd suggest you do is do a search on the internet for black and white photo or whatever. And you know how you can do an image search where you get hundreds or thousands of images? Scroll through until you see a toned black and white that you like. and just have it sitting there in your web browser, smaller window off to the side. And then move these sliders until your picture looks similar to the one you see online, because oftentimes it's really hard to gauge if you're not used to it. How colorful should this thing be? Because you're too connected to the photo and you're too thinking about the color. Whereas when you're browsing online, your brain's a little bit more open and it's comparing it to other images that you're seeing, and you're like, this one looks overdone, this one looks just right. And it's harder to see what's overdone and what's just right when you're just staring at one image. It's nice to see it in comparison to others. So that could be useful. Then there was one final one. Let's just look at the colors that were applied. So this looks like a yellowish in the highlights, a blue in the shadows, and if I didn't have it on there, it would look like that. And I had to mess with the balance just a little bit to get the control. So we have black and white, which is just a checkbox found under the HSL tab. Pulls all the color out of your picture. And then we have split toning, which pushes color back in. You don't have to put it in both the highlights and the shadows. I happen to in all these examples, but it doesn't mean you have to. When it comes to the Opera House image, it might just be some yellowish in the highlights, that kind of thing. And I find most people primarily use it for black and white, but I find it equally as useful in color. Just anytime the dark part of your picture, the color there bugs you, split toning will allow you to get in there. All right. Questions? We've done a lot here.
Yes, we have a couple questions actually for about Lightroom and why Ben's not using Lightroom or when Ben uses Lightroom. This is a Photoshop 101 class, so we're going to stay in Photoshop, Adobe Camera Raw, Bridge. But when would you use Lightroom, I guess, in your own workflow?
If I own
outside of this
Lightroom,
course?
yeah, if I own Lightroom and that's how I organize my pictures,
Yeah.
anything you see me do in Bridge or in Camera Raw, I would do in Lightroom.
Okay.
But what's cool is Lightroom has the same adjustment sliders as Camera Raw, so that anything I show you to do here, any concept I show you, equally applies to Lightroom. You just got to figure out where is this feature in Lightroom. And in Lightroom, when it comes to the HSL sliders, let's say, and the split toning sliders, they're in the Develop module, where you find all the other sliders for adjusting your picture. And on the right side of your screen, instead of presenting you with a series of tabs that we have to click through like we have in Camera Raw, it's just a long list you have to scroll through. And in that scrollable list, you'll find the HSL slider sitting there, and you'll also find the choice called split toning. And they'll have the same general options. The one thing I should mention, though, when it comes to adjusting color, is that when I went up to the top of my screen and went to this icon here, Lightroom, you won't find the icon there. Instead, let's say these were the Lightroom sliders. Let's just say I'm in Lightroom. Instead, over here is going to be something that looks similar to a donut. It's just a little icon that looks like a donut. And if you click on it, it's the equivalent to using this tool right here. If the donut is turned on, it means if you move your mouse on top of your picture and you click and drag, it will grab one of the HSL sliders and move it for you, just like that tool did. All right? Looks like a little donut, and it's right over by your adjustment sliders themselves. If you ever see it, it means that if you turn it on and then you move your mouse on top of your picture and click, it's going to do something related to this adjustment. And it's found not only in HSL, but in other areas as well in Lightroom. So yeah, it doesn't matter if somebody teaches me something in Lightroom, and I just happen to be working in ACR, it still applies. ACR means Adobe Camera Raw. Yeah, Lightroom is pretty much replaces Bridge and replaces Camera Raw. So anything I do in those two areas, do it in Lightroom instead. And that's a great thing to do. That's what I would do day to day. It's just, this is not a Lightroom seminar. So,
right.
Yeah.
If you click the targeted adjustment and then do whatever you want to do, how do you then turn off the targeted adjustment?
How do you get out of that tool? Just switch to a different tool. Meaning, usually click on the hand tool. The hand tool is the most neutral tool up there, where if you click on it, you can't damage your picture with the hand tool. So anytime I'm done using any of these tools, I just switch to the hand. Yeah. And that gets you out of it. What other questions do we have online?
How can you toggle on and off all the adjustments that you've made rather than those in just the current pane?
Okay, let's come in here. It depends on what version of Photoshop you have,
Okay.
Because they've made changes to this recently. And in some versions, you're going to find a preview checkbox that's near the top. It's up where my mouse is moving around right now. And that preview checkbox is like the icon I've been using that only turns off the settings for the tab you're working on. You can always go to the menu that's on the side, and that's where you'll find a choice called Camera Raw Defaults. You could choose that to get you to your default settings, and then you could type the keyboard shortcut for undo, which is Command-Z, Control-Z in Windows. Type it a second time, and it brings you back to the defaults, and you could use that for before and after. That's for old versions, where you don't have the features I'm about to show you. Okay? So Camera Raw Defaults and undo. Then in the newest versions of Photoshop, they added these icons. And I'm not a huge fan of icons unless the icons are overly obvious. And in Photoshop, they have way too many icons that you're like, what the heck does that thing do? Especially if you look up here, it's like, what the heck is that supposed to represent? Well, it's supposed to represent a target. It's the targeted adjustment tool. So in the little crosshair usually means somewhere you click. So, and the arrow means there's a menu here. So it's like a cluttered icon that doesn't really help. So that's why you hover over it to see what you have. Now, having said that, it's kind of picking on the interface designers. There's a good reason to do icons. If you do text, you have to come up with a short word to fit in an area, and Photoshop isn't just available in English. You have to make sure there's an appropriate word in all the other languages that it's available in all that. So icons are just a good compromise in some cases. So in case that one of the interface designers is listening in, they're like, he has no idea. So anyway, we have these other icons. Let's see what they do. First off, notice that one of the icons has, well, it might look like a T, but it's supposed to be a triangle in the corner. It's just we have so few icons or so few pixels to use to make it up. That is a triangle. And anytime you see a tiny triangle, it means that if I click and hold, there's going to be more there, right? So with that one, if I click and hold, you'll see a pop-up menu appear. Right now we're in single view, which means we can only see the after or the before. And we can switch between these other views. And we can do it by either choosing these individually or just clicking the icon over and over, because it cycles through those choices. Each time I click it, it changes. So let's take a look if I click there. Click. Now we have a before and after side by side. And the icon changes to reflect that. It shows two things side by side. If I click it again, we have it now where it's supposed to be showing us side by side, or split down the middle. Click it again, we have above and below. Again, it's supposed to be splitting it down the middle, and so on. But there are ways that we can control what it considers to be the before and the after when we're in these. And that's why this can sometimes look a little odd, because right now it's not showing before and after, because the before would look lousier than this. Let's say I wanted to experiment at this point. If I now have two versions of my image. The one on the right is the after, which means it reflects the sliders that I have here. If I come in and do something like convert this to grayscale, only the after side is changing. But here's what's cool if I want to experiment. I can take this little arrow that's here, and do you see what it says? It says copy current settings to before. That means take the settings that are currently on here, hit this little arrow, and consider that to be the before image. So the before doesn't have to be the original. Then I can continue to experiment. Maybe I come over here and I do split toning. And I say on this image, I'm going to come in, hold on, Option, and I see it only on that one side here. Choose the color that I like, decide how much of it I want in there, and I'm comparing it now to the before that I want to look at. And before doesn't have to mean default. Okay? And so I could go in there, and then maybe I say, well, I like that, but I don't know, maybe I want a cool version instead. But I'm not sure. So why not push those settings over to the before side with that little arrow? bonk, and then experiment with a cool version to compare it to. Well, actually, I like the yellow highlights, just not very much. Let's do blue shadows. And then only bring a little hint in. And now I can compare them side by side. Now, the reason why the before didn't show the default settings is it was showing whatever was applied to the image when I opened it. And when I opened it, we weren't at default settings. So therefore, it was showing what I've done in this session of editing compared to what I had when I started this session of editing. Then, if you decide after experimenting like this with these side by side that, well, the version that says after right now, I actually don't like that. I wish I didn't experiment and go with a cool image. I prefer the one that's over there that's called before. So what you can do is down here, there's something with double arrows. And that means switch what's considered before and after. And if I do that, now the two images swap. And if I get out of this view, where I'm no longer looking at before and afters, which means go to single view, that's the version I have. Because whatever's on the right side in this case, or whatever's labeled after, is considered to be your current settings. And so when I told it to swap them, I really said, I prefer what I had earlier, move the sliders over to those settings right now. So that's what we truly have. So what do we have here? We have a letter Y that if we click on, will split your view before and after. And so I could come here and get it to split down the middle, split this way, split down the middle again, or show me just the one view. And if I want to control what's over on the other side, in this case, let's say I want to get the default settings over there. Well, what I might want to do is, since I don't want to lose this, I'm going to switch the two sides. And then I'll take the side I'm working on. I'm always working on the after side. And I'll say go to default settings. And then I'll switch the two sides again. So now I just shoved the defaults over to that side. Usually the defaults will be over there if this is the first time you've adjusted the raw file. If it's the second time you open it, then what it says before, it means whatever it looked like at the moment you opened it in camera raw for this editing session. So here's before and after now. And when I want to get out of it, I come over here and choose a choice called single view, which you can get to either by clicking on this icon a whole bunch of times or just by clicking and holding and choosing single view. So anyway, that's kind of interesting. It's a little more complex than a simple preview button, but it's a heck of a lot more useful if you learn how to use it. So this gives you your general view that you have, and then this icon means if I'm seeing two versions, a before and an after, take the after version and shove it over to the before side. So that's considered the before version, because I want to continue experimenting. And then if you continue experimenting, you're like, oh man, I really screwed this up. Back when I shoved the settings I wanted over to the before side, I liked it better. Well, that's when you take this little thing and say swap the two. Take what's over on the before side and push it over to the after side. And then you just get out of that double preview view and you have whatever is labeled after. That's always what the sliders are showing. So anyway, that's kind of a weird icons. Allows you to do all sorts of weird stuff, but hopefully it gives you some idea. Just know that when you go in there, the before is whatever it looked like when you opened that file. And if that was not default settings, like this being black and white, that's going to be the before. So, all right. But I'm glad that came up because I really needed to get into it.
That's a really good explanation. Somebody asked, is it more accurate to shoot in black and white, or can you just adjust to get the same accuracy once you're in Photoshop or
I would
SDR?
shoot in color.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because then you have the information, right?
Well, because otherwise, if I shoot in black and white, you're choosing your color to black and white conversion settings in your camera before you press the shutter. And it's impossible to judge the best settings for an image before you actually take it. Well, I wouldn't say it's impossible, but you would have to go in there and adjust the settings that are in the menu system for your camera before you took every single picture in order to make it look ideal. You'd say, this one's got a blue sky, therefore I'm going to do different settings than this one, which is overcast and doesn't have any blue in it, and therefore doesn't need the blue to be emphasized. It's much better to adjust it afterwards. The only thing I might do is you could when you set it to black and white, it shouldn't in general affect a RAW file, because a RAW file is taking the raw data off your camera sensor. You could shoot RAW plus JPEG, you'd get black and white JPEGs, and the RAW file should still have color. And therefore, on the back of your camera, you could preview it a little bit, and maybe that would be useful for visualization. But otherwise, I always shoot in color.